welcome everybody. My name's Chris Lloyd. I'm the Secretary General for RUMA. We're pleased to bring the webinar to you this afternoon. As you know, the title of this afternoon's webinar is Nematodirus, Are We Giving the Right Advice? And I think it's a really topical headline subject for us to discuss, and judging by the interest from the number of people that booked in, we've hit the spot. Importantly, although RUMA are bringing this webinar to you this afternoon, we're really pleased to have the support of a number of organisations who are all involved in this space. So SCOPS, the Sustainable Control of Parasites in Sheep, Sheep Vet Society, the British Veterinary Association, and we're really pleased to have Lindsay from the Moredun. But SCOPS is a wide group of organisations, and this event has been put on with the support of a number of other organisations that are part of the SCOPS group. You'll have realised that attendees' cameras and microphones are off, just so that it's not confusing for everybody. The chat function's also off, so we don't have sideline conversations, but the Q&A is on. So if you want to pose a question to the panellists as the webinar progresses, by all means put that into the Q&A. We've got 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the webinar for that, and I think that's a really important part of how we use the advice and interpret the advice. So we would welcome your questions, and we'll see how we go in terms of answering those questions at the end of the session. So people are still coming in. That probably is because of the demand. I always think of it as a doorway, and everyone's squeezing through the doorway. It's a very big room when we get in there, but you've all got to come in through the same doorway. What I'd like to do while we're just allowing people in is if I could just ask our panelists to introduce themselves and explain why they're here this afternoon on our panel. Leslie, if I can come to you first.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks. I'm Leslie Stubbings. I'm a technical advisor with SCOPS. I've been working with SCOPS for a number of years, but in my day job, I am still working very much on farm with farmers. So the sort of things we're going to be talking about today are really close to my heart as well.
Thanks. And Lindsay.
Hi everyone, I'm Lindsay Melville. I'm a parasitologist from Moredun Research Institute. My interest in Nematodirus is quite a long one. I did my PhD on the epidemiology of this worm and emergence of resistance in the species. So yes, lots of interest in the topic. So thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. Thanks, Lindsay. Philippa?
Hi, Chris. Thank you. So I'm Philippa Page. I'm a sheep vet and I work with Flock Health Limited, and I also work with Nardis. I'm the current president of the Sheep Veterinary Society, and I work with a lot of farmers across the UK, spend a lot of time talking about parasite control on farm. So yeah, it's great that I'm here today. Thank you.
Yeah, it is great to have your in the field experience, Philippa. Thanks for joining us. And last but not least, Neris.
Hi, Chris. Hi, everybody. Yes, I'm Neris Wright. I'm also a technical advisor at SCOPS, working alongside Leslie. Same day job as well. I'm also a sheep consultant working day to day with farmers. So I'm here just to sort of close the evening and signpost everybody to additional resources and other activity that SCOPS will be doing. So if everyone hangs on till the end, they'll get to find out what other activity we do in addition to Nematodirus.
So I noticed the numbers of attendees are still creeping up a bit. So welcome to anyone who's just joined us. We're going to move on and start the formal presentations. Otherwise, we won't finish at the end of the day if we wait for everyone to get in. But part of the problem, I think, it's not a problem, it's a good thing. We've had an amazing response to the webinar. And I think that just shows that the topic that SCOPS have chosen this afternoon is of interest to an awful lot of farmers, vets, SQPs and their advisors. So hopefully over the course of the next hour or so, we can delve into Nematodirus and the pain that it is to everybody, but provide some understanding and some clarification. So I'm going to kick off this afternoon by coming to you, Leslie, if we could, with just to ask for a bit of a background to SCOPS and then lead us into the Nematodirus tool.
Yep. Thanks, Chris. That's great. And thank you for inviting me as well. So Chris has asked me just to say a little bit about SCOPS and how its background, so everyone's on the same page really. And I think it's quite important in the context of what we're talking about this afternoon. I mean, SCOPS was formed over 20 years ago now, and it was done because we recognised that if we were going to try and slow down the development of anthelmintic resistance, then we really had to start tackling what were quite complicated issues and moving away from what had been quite a formulaic, regular routine worming, which I think anybody who was working in this field in the 70s and 80s will recognise. And it was complicated. So there were three reasons why SCOPS was formed in the first place. One was we recognised we needed to have some consistency of information. It can be confusing, and this is one of the reasons why we're talking about Nematodirus this afternoon. And we also recognise that the industry isn't just farmers, isn't just vets. There's a plethora of organisations, which you'll see in a minute, are involved within SCOPS, and we all needed to be on the same page. We also needed to start to have an evidence base and to really make sure the messaging that we were all signing up to was supported by the best science. Hence, we work very closely with people like Moredun, SRUC and other research organisations across the world. It had to be evidence-based and supported by R&D, and constantly we are trying to update that. And it had to be trusted. So the SCOPS brand was deliberately done. We weren't trying to be clever and sell it, but we wanted it so that whenever you see that sheep logo, you can be fairly confident that it is going to be trustworthy. So who are SCOPS? Well, it is a pan-industry group, and this is really where I think its strength comes from. We don't have very much money as a budget, but what we do have is massive, massive buy-in across the industry. So from the research people, from, for example, Moredun, right the way through to the manufacturers, to those people who are responsible for prescribing and selling anthelmintics, parasiticides, Sheep Vet Society, and you can see on there the levy bodies are also really involved and are our core funders actually. So it is very important. Sometimes it might slow us down a little bit, but to us that is where the strength comes from, is that everybody is involved. And of course, Chris, I didn't mention RUMA there, but right in the middle, RUMA are also very important. And it does allow us then, when we do decide what the message is going to be, for example, on the group 4-5 products, when they became available, we developed that over a course of time, and we were able to promulgate that widely, sort of, if you like, horizontally in the industry as well as vertically within the industry. And our raison d'etre is to slow the development of resistance to parasiticides, of course, and not just wormers now, but also ectoparasiticides would come in that remit. And quite simply, you know, the trick is that what we need to do is to move and try and get people to adopt more sustainable practices when products are still relatively effective. So to try and keep them at the top end of that graph, because that's when we have most impact, and it's when it's going to have increase the longevity of the products that we do have. And the simple message really is that what we're trying to do with any parasiticide is use as much as necessary, but as little as possible. And that's really going to be the framework which we're going to talk about the Nematodirus forecast on today. Having said that, of course, and I'm sure that everybody listening today has the same priority. Our priority is the health and welfare of the animals and the productivity of those animals. But if we want to try and just break down what we're trying to do into 3 simple things, then we really have the first one, which is when we are using a parasiticide, we need to use it correctly and effectively. So right product, right time, right dose. And we know that there's a vast number of doses still given of parasiticides that are sublethal, if you like. They're not the right dose, and that encourages resistance. We need to target the use, and this again comes back to what we're talking about this afternoon. So selection of the right animals, not treating every animal on the farm, but risk assessing and working out which animals are going to, either as groups or as individuals, benefit from a treatment. and reducing our reliance on parasiticides. So using the management tools we have available, grazing management, breeding, nutrition, all of the other things that we have available to us to try and reduce our reliance and use this little as possible. And just finally, before we go on to just looking at the Nematodirus forecast, just in passing really, in the last 2 or 3 years particularly, many people will be aware there's a lot more talk about parasiticides in the environment. I see the VMD have just released something today looking at pet products, but we are very aware that whenever we're using parasiticides, there is going to be an exposure to the environment and fauna. But just really to say that actually where we come from is that if we use this mantra of as much as necessary, as little as possible, of course, that's also applying to not just exposure of the parasites, but exposure of the environment. So using those principles is allowing us to take some pressure off there as well. Okay, so just quickly, I'm going to introduce the Nematodirus forecast. We've made some, we'd like to think, upgrades this time. It is going to be a little bit different and hopefully a little bit more user-friendly, and people get more out of it. We became a little bit concerned that the forecast was really being used as the be-all and end-all of risk, and we've tried to take that out of it because the risk to the animals is actually very much to do with the animals themselves. What the forecast is doing for us is telling us whether or not Nematodirus is hatching at peak rates, at high rates, and therefore is putting those at-risk animals in the place where they may suffer from nematodirosis. And I know that Philippa and Lindsay will talk about that in much more detail. But the first thing you will see with this now is that the hatching forecast has got some changes. It has got hatching in the title, and rather than Nematodirus forecast, because what it's doing is it's predicting or forecasting when we expect to see a peak hatch. And I will come back to that in a minute, and I'll show you the actual forecast itself live. Why have a forecast? Why would we have a forecast? And I think the thing we have to remember, and the others I'm sure will mention this several times, is that nematodirosis can strike very quickly, particularly if we have a cold spell followed by a very rapid warm-up, and then we get these mass hatches, and suddenly on pasture there is a real crescendo of infective larvae that lambs can pick up. And of course that hatching is driven by temperature. So the work that Hannah Vernier very much pioneered, it's her work this is based on. This is air temperature that is driving that hatching. But what we also know is that because it's immature larvae that are doing the damage, fecal egg counts are at best misleading, at worst they can be dangerous, because if you wait for that, you could already have disease in lambs, or if you're waiting for it, you could treat very much, a lot of people are treating unnecessarily as well, which is what we're trying to get away from. So it is these immature larvae here, and you can see them in that photograph, and I credit that to Ben Strugnell who's allowed me to use that. You can see those nasty little blighters in there. They're not egg laying. They are immature larvae, and they are the ones that are doing the damage, as Lindsay, I'm sure, will explain in more detail. Now, the other thing about a forecast is what we find is when we start looking, and we've been recording this data now for several years, is that if you take one weather station, as you've got here, and you look at it over a 6-year period, this is Watnell in England, you've got a 7-week range in peak hatching. So from the end of March to the end of May nearly is the window in which peak hatching has occurred on that one weather station. And so this idea that farmers, and I know we all like to do it, well, it gets to this stage and that's when I'm going to treat my lambs for nematodirosis. I think that one graph sums up why it is so important that we have the forecast on a year-to-year basis. So just before I show you the forecast, what we're also trying to encourage people to do this year, and we've got a little pop-up video into how to use the forecast with Hannah Vernier herself explaining, is that we want you to think in terms of risk assessing the lambs first. Are the lambs that you've got, the groups of lambs that you've got, actually at risk? And we've got these little chaps here grazing. Hopefully that's working for everybody. So assess the lambs in the field first. First and foremost, is the field actually contaminated? In this case, yes, it is. It's a paddock next to me and it gets used every year. It also gets used for all the problem animals. So these lambs are actually barely 4 weeks old because the ewes are under pressure, they're problems. So, but normally they would be 6 to 12 weeks of age. And are there any other concurrent issues such as coccidiosis? And I'm sure Lindsay and Philippa are going to go more into this. These lambs, as I've just said, are about 4 weeks old. You can see them grazing away merrily there because mum isn't milking very well. They've actually been grazing quite heavily for a while. But then if I looked at the forecast for then, this video was taken in the middle of April, what I found was the peak hatch had happened about 4 or 5 weeks earlier. And therefore, by assessing, but then going and looking at it, I could look at the animals, think they're perfectly all right. The peak hatch has gone. I don't need to treat them. And that's the sort of thing, that's what we're really trying to concentrate on this time, is to really target down into those groups that need it, get the right time and the right animals. So I'm going to try this now and try to go through to the live forecast. So I'm hoping that that live forecast is showing. Chris, can you unmute and just tell me if that's okay, please, because I can't see you anymore.
Just waiting for it to come through, Leslie.
Okay.
Just while Leslie's pulling that up, I'll just remind everybody that if you've got questions, please drop them into the Q&A. We'll have a look at those when we get through to the panel session. We won't do questions until we get to the end.
It's all right. I've gone back out and come back in. Okay,
Yeah.
you got it now?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay,
yep,
apologies, folks. We knew there might be a little bit of an issue on that one. Okay, so this is the forecast, the main page of the forecast. And now when you actually click onto it, what will happen is that the video that's under here, the first time you click onto it, what you'll find is it will pop up and it will more or less force you to watch it. It's not very long. You can see it's 1.1 minute 46 seconds, but that is a little video as to how to use it. It won't pop up the second time you use it. After that, you would have to click on the button because we don't want to annoy you all too much. The forecast itself then is based on 140 weather stations, and these weather stations, it's air temperature, and as you can see, we're looking at hatching, and what it's doing is it's predicting, forecasting when we think the hatching is really going to get going, and therefore vulnerable lambs that we've risk assessed might be in the firing line for nematodirosis. And you can see we've also changed, the colours have changed, that stayed the same, but instead of using risk, we've gone to hatching. And what we're really looking for is hatching imminent. When it turns orange, that means we'll keep an eye on things very carefully over a period of time, and then hatching in progress. And we've also added this post-hatch, so that the triangles actually tell us when hatching has finished. And if we have a look through here, and just very quickly, I know Philippa will show this again later. It's being slow to load now. Come on. Don't be slow. There we go. You can see what happens is, and the 26 data will be up there when we go live on Monday. You can see things going. So you get peak hatch and then we go post hatch. And that is where we want to really know that we've gone past that peak and therefore we don't need to be worrying too much. Okay. Go back again. So what we need to do to use it is to find the weather station which is actually nearest to you, or might not be the nearest. And I've picked two here as an example. So here we've got, so you might be thinking that Exeter Airport is your nearest. Come on, play, please. There, there we go. And that obviously hatching's in progress. This is live. This is what's happening at the moment. So Exeter is already on a red and we've got hatching in progress. But you can see that Exeter is only 27 metres above sea level. If, on the other hand, not too far away, we have got Dunkeswell Aerodrome that's 252 meters above sea level, and therefore that might be a little bit further away from you, but height wise, elevation wise, it might be the one that's most appropriate. So it's always worth having a look and deciding which is the best for you. And if we just go back to Exeter again, come on, there we go. We've also improved what's under the buttons. So we're hoping you've done a risk assessment first, but we've also improved this. So it's telling you hatching is in progress. If you haven't done the risk assessment, you can click through to it and do it then. If you have, that's fine, but it also gives you some prompts here about the fact that if it's a south-facing field or a north-facing field, obviously south they will hatch earlier, north it will be later, and also a guide to 100 meters above or below where the station is will have a plus or minus 7 days difference on the hatch. So there's quite a lot of information in there. There's quite a few things you can look at before you actually decide whether or not you're going to take a decision and perhaps move the lambs. That might be an option rather than treating, or whether or not you're actually going to go in and treat a specific group of lambs. So Chris, I think that is me.
Great, Leslie, thank you.
And we can always come back to the, if people want to the forecast later, and just to say that it is going live on Monday.
Yeah, thank you. I'll ask Lindsay to join us and get her presentation ready. Oh, that's come up really quickly. I did have a quick question, Leslie, if I may, Chairman's prerogative. So as I've just heard you there, it's really key to do that risk assessment on the farm in terms of age of lambs, the potential contamination of that field before you go to the forecast.
Absolutely, that's what we would encourage people to do on the basis that we're trying to target those groups that need it and not have to worry about those that don't. So I think it's really important that we do that, and that first and foremost, are they on a contaminated field?
And I shouldn't be surprised, but that 7-week variation between the peak hatch, that's quite amazing. And I think that probably demonstrates partly why this as a pest worries us so much as farmers, because it can strike so quickly, and you haven't got a fecal egg count to kind of give you that ongoing guide. It is about that assessment of the field, of the stock themselves, and then the change in seasonal situations. So I think that probably highlights why we've got so much interest in today's session. So Lindsay, you'll probably explain some of that to us in your from the parasitologist perspective. I'll hand the floor to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on Nematodirus as a parasite. So Nematodirus is a gastrointestinal nematode. It typically infects young lambs, like Leslie was saying, kind of 6 to 12 weeks old as they're starting to graze more. And it's generally seen as causing acute scouring and dehydration. And it can cause quite heavy disease and mortality in heavily infected lambs. Now, unlike some of the other gut roundworms that are infecting sheep, Nematodirus is slightly different, and that's thought to be because it's an Arctic-derived worm. Now, what that means for us is that it has slightly different patterns of its life cycle, and I'll talk you through those as we go on. Although it's come from the Arctic, it is endemic throughout the UK. We see it all over, as well as in a lot of Nordic countries as well. And we can generally use white drenches to control it. So a little note on the life cycle. Now, it's a direct parasitic life cycle like all of the other gut roundworms of sheep. So the larvae are ingested from with the pasture. Adult worms develop within the small intestines. They then lay eggs, which are passed out in the feces of the lambs. Now, where Nematodirus differs slightly is that the rest of our roundworms tend to hatch very quickly, and then the larval stages develop on pasture. Nematodirus is slightly different. It stays within its eggshell, develops right through to the infective larvae stage, but it remains encased in that eggshell, and it'll sit there quite happily on pasture for the rest of the year, before it'll then hatch once environmental conditions become optimal again. Now, that's quite an important difference for this parasite, because it protects that, being in that eggshell protects it from adverse conditions, and so we see a high level of survival in Nematodirus. So we can see these high egg hatching occurrences. So how does that look in terms of the different seasons? Well, if you have a little look at the graphic in the middle, we start off in spring. Young lambs are being infected. They're passing out eggs onto pasture. Those eggs will have developed within the summer, but they'll stay within their eggshells through autumn and winter. And in winter, they're receiving that kind of icy chill, and it's thought that that has a role to play in the way that Nematodirus hatches synchronously in spring. As that temperature increases in the following spring, we then see these mass hatching events. So it's important to bear in mind then that transmission really is occurring from one spring lamb crop to the next, and it's those fields which we've had spring lambs on one spring that will be the high risk fields for the following spring, as those eggs have laid dormant on those pastures. So as Leslie was saying, we really need to think about the risk. When are lambs at risk? And it's what we need is for both the synchronous hatching of Nematodirus eggs and the grazing of those susceptible lambs to occur at the same time. And that's when we can see acute disease in the lambs. And that acute disease is typically, signs of it are a really kind of profuse, watery, yellow-green diarrhea, dehydration in those lambs, and we can see some quite sudden deaths as well. You can also get a chronic disease in lambs, and this is more when the lambs see a much lower level of challenge, and that's characterised by the kind of dirty breech soiling, loss of appetite and rough wool. But because of this loss of appetite, we see a real check in the growth rate of lambs. And where we've looked at it across seasons, where lambs have that early growth check in spring, they don't tend to recover that same growth level later in the season. So they can become kind of poor productivity lambs later in the season. So if we look into the lamb and see, well, what's happening at a gut level, these pictures are electron micrographs of the surface of the small intestine. You can see in picture A, there's a worm kind of coiled around the microvilli of the small intestine. And what it's doing there is it's holding it on to the villi, kind of anchoring itself in place to stop it from being washed down the gut. And it's just absorbing nutrients as it sits there. That obviously has an impact on those microvilli, and you can see that in the second image B there, which is a post-infection image. So instead of having nice kind of finger-like villi, we see this kind of damaged surface to the small intestine, and that's going to reduce the lamb's ability to absorb nutrients. Like we've said, some of the most severe disease that's caused by Nematodirus is actually caused by the immature worms migrating through the gut. And this is really important to bear in mind, as that acute disease can cause death in lambs before the parasites are old enough to be laying eggs. And so therefore, fecal egg counts really are not the best approach to be diagnosing Nematodirus. So I've spoke to you a bit about the kind of disease, but luckily, because lambs often see this kind of high challenge of Nematodirus in spring, they also develop immunity to Nematodirus relatively quickly. If they've seen this high challenge and they've developed immunity, it's then maintained in the long term. But if lambs aren't exposed to that high challenge in spring, they will remain susceptible to Nematodirus infection either later in the year or the following spring. And that's because we don't see a kind of cross immunity if they're exposed to other roundworms later in the summer. They're still susceptible to Nematodirus later in the season. So it's good to keep an eye on what they've been exposed to in the spring and how likely they are to be to have developed a robust immunity. So going back to this idea of which lambs are at risk, and we've said that we need to have the kind of perfect storm of synchronous egg hatching in Nematodirus and also the grazing of susceptible lambs in order to have acute disease. As Leslie was saying, the timing of that spring hatch of Nematodirus is highly dependent on weather conditions. We know that climate change is a progressing problem for us all, and so there's been some work to look at what impact will climate change likely have on parasite hatching. So these two graphs here, they show the cream bars at the bottom show peak lambing times in different regions of the UK, and the black and red lines are predicted peak hatch for Nematodirus under different climate change scenarios. Obviously, we don't know how climate change will progress, but these are some kind of best guesses that have been put into the models. And the point I wanted to get across here is if we look at that first one for southwest England, you can see that under certain climate change scenarios, that peak Nematodirus hatch may move earlier in the year, and it could coincide with the timing of lambing, in which case our lambs are unlikely to be grazing at that really early age. So there's a chance then that there might be a kind of phenological mismatch between the availability of larvae on pasture and the grazing of young lambs. If we compare that to the Scotland graph, you can see there's still a little bit of separation between lambing dates and predicted peak hatch for the worms. And so it's likely then that acute disease could be more more likely in these situations. So going forward, we have to be aware, cognizant that peak Nematodirus hatch could move with changing climate and changing weather patterns, but it might impact on the potential risk that our lambs see to Nematodirus. So moving on to control, there's different ways that we control this parasite. The first being grazing management. As I've said, there's high risk fields, and these are the fields which carried young lambs the previous spring. And so one way to control Nematodirus would be to avoid grazing these fields at high risk times with susceptible lambs. I understand that these high risk fields are often, the kind of lambing fields that are close by the yard. And so in many cases, it's not possible to avoid grazing those at high risk times. And that's when we would turn to anthelmintic treatment to control Nematodirus. So we tend to use benzimidazole or white drenches for the control of Nematodirus. The use of white drenches for lots of the other roundworms that infect sheep, we see a lot of anthelmintic resistance in the other gut roundworms across the UK to white drenches, not on all farms, but on a lot. But Nematodirus was previously believed to be unable to develop resistance. So the first cases of anthelmintic resistance in this roundworm were actually identified in 2010. We've since done a bit of work to look at the prevalence of white drench resistance in Nematodirus. So this study was part of my PhD, and what we did is we went out and looked at 289 flocks. You can see on the little graph there, tried to cover quite a lot of the UK. And we found that BZ resistance was at an early stage in Nematodirus, but bear in mind this study was 10 years ago, so it's not the most up-to-date of results. We looked genetically at the mutations which code for resistance and identified them on a third of the farms tested. Now, at the graph at the bottom, each bar represents a different farm. All of the blue bars are susceptible, so these are Nematodirus populations that we would expect to be cleared by a BZ treatment, and the warmer colours are resistance. So you can see there's just a smattering of resistance across the country, but there were a few places in which resistance hotspots were more evident. But despite this, we would still conclude that benzimidazole should work well on the majority of farms to treat Nematodirus. But bearing in mind that resistance has been identified, it's important to check that the treatment was successful. So we would do this using a fecal egg count 7 to 10 days after treatment. Now, I know that I've said fecal egg counts are not recommended for the diagnosis of Nematodirus, and this was due to the worms not being old enough to be laying eggs. But when we're thinking about worms surviving treatment, because we're checking the egg count 7 to 10 days after treatment, it gives us that opportunity for the worms to have developed to patency in that time. So it's a good option for checking that the treatment was effective. So benzimidazoles are still the recommended one, both because of the high safety index of this treatment, but also that it can safeguard the other anthelmintic classes for later in the year. The other anthelmintic classes will be effective against Nematodirus, and it's a possible option if you think that the lambs could be we could have co-infections with other strong gal nematodes. So something else to consider in your risk assessment. So that's pretty much it from me. I'll run you through a few take-home messages just to highlight a few important points. So first of all, the difference between Nematodirus and other gut roundworms is the infective larvae develop within the egg. They'll lay dormant until the conditions are optimal for hatching. The acute disease can occur before parasite eggs appear in the feces, so it's important not to rely on fecal egg counts to diagnose Nematodirus. And to bear in mind that high-risk fields are those which carried young lambs in the previous spring. There's a few different ways of controlling Nematodirus through grazing management, avoiding grazing young lambs on high-risk pastures at high-risk times, or the use of anthelmintic treatments, but bear in mind that low-level BZ resistance has been identified. So I'm going to round up there and say thank you very much for listening, and I'll pass back over to Chris.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'll ask Philippa to get her slides ready, but just while she's pulling that up, you've answered one of my questions, which was how do we test for resistance? So you still do you treat and then do a fecal egg count 7 to 10 days later. So that's answered that one. Thank you. But there's one in the chat about, which I think is a quick and easy one, so I'll take the risk of asking it now. Does ploughing break the cycle? So if you had sheep on a field one spring, you ploughed it that autumn, reseeded it, and it was a reseed the following spring, is there a risk?
So
or is there any exposure?
Ploughing will drastically reduce the number of worms on that pasture. It does depend on the depth of the ploughing. Obviously, if it's a deep plough, then it will vastly reduce, but it won't reduce it all the way to zero. And because that's largely because of the margins around the field, which won't be ploughed, but which will still be grazed by the sheep. So yes, it will vastly reduce the contamination level on that pasture. Right.
So Philippa, we're coming to you now as a vet in the field, and you're dealing with questions from farmers and advisors who are trying to interpret the advice. So give us the perspective I think you've got some case studies to share with us to put the information we've heard into some sort of real life context. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Thanks. Yeah, we thought that'd be useful to try and pull this together and look at how it presents maybe sometimes in practice and the difficulties that we can find when we're trying to decide when to treat. So I've got a couple of cases. So I'm going to go. Works. Oops, second. There we go. So this is a case, there might be a bit of back and forwards with the slides. This case was June last year. So a farmer had submitted a muck sample for a fecal egg count. This was a pooled count from 10 lambs. The muck was soft, nothing unusual. And then the egg count that was received back showed a moderate count of Trichostrongyle type eggs, 425, 200 of Nematodirus, and some coccidia eggs in there as well. And the question is often, does the farmer need to treat the lambs? So this could be the vet trying to answer this question, the SQP trying to answer this question, or the farmer themselves if they've done the muck sample. And the answer initially is that we can't answer that just based upon these results. We've got to think, based on what we've just heard previously, we've got to think of all the other things that may affect this. And on that, we just can't answer. So we need to, as Leslie and Lindsay have already touched on, we need to know what the risk factors are. So what are the age of those animals that from which this muck sample has been gathered? What's the local hatching forecast? And again, important in terms of what's the local weather station, but then how high up are they? What's the altitude? Is it similar? Is it higher? Is it lower? What the current weather is? Has there been that cold snap? Is there moisture on the pasture? And then the clinical appearance of the lambs. So are they showing clinical signs of parasites, or do they look okay? And where are they grazing? So have they been grazing those pastures that were grazed last spring by younger lambs? And do we consider there to be any other infection at the same time? So all of these things we need to think about, and trace element as well, whether they've had any recent supplementation. Is it a farm that suffers with trace element deficiencies? And then the final question I always like to ask and just discuss is, how did they get that sample? What was the process that they went through to actually get that? And I'm thinking in terms of accuracy of sampling technique and so on. But in the main, those first questions is what I'm thinking about, and I think, and we all need to think about before we can answer the question on whether we need to treat. So in this particular case, these samples were taken in June. The animals were old enough, they were in an at-risk age group because they were around 8 weeks old. They were certainly consuming grass. This area was near to the Aberporth weather station, which I'll show in a second, and based on the forecast of the hatching, occurred there from mid-March, with the post-hatching having happened in April. So this is now a lower risk. So that hatch has occurred despite the fact that the animals are at the right age and that they're grazing quite a lot of grass. Clinically, the animals look well. They were growing. There was no concerns there. They were grazing pasture. As Leslie mentioned, it's really common to be grazing pasture that was grazed the previous spring. These animals were, so that was at risk. But we didn't suspect any other concurrent infection, and they had a trace element drench when they'd had their first Ovivac-P vaccination. So could kind of say there were some risk factors there, but they were lower. And this was just to show you some of these animals. So this was one of these lambs, looking well. And this weather station here is Aberporth. This is the nearby weather station. If we can see, actually, we went quite suddenly into peak hatching there at that time, and tailing off like towards April. But the samples that we're talking about here was in June, so we were past that risk period. So not surprising actually that going back to the fecal egg count, that we've got some Nematodirus eggs in there because they've had some exposure, but yet the risk had passed for these animals. So the answer is, do we need to treat these lambs? Based on those factors, no. Unlikely, very unlikely to need to be treated for Nematodirus for the reasons as discussed. There's some immunity starting to develop because we've got those Nematodirus eggs in there, so they've had exposure, which is a positive, but they're clinically well and they're unaffected. They're unaffected because they've got good immunity and they're older, and we've considered the trace elements. I've put a caveat there that I always like to consider whether there's quite a large spread of ages of lambs in the group, and do we need to think about younger lambs, or they may also have a different group of later lambing animals on the farm that you might need to talk about. So it's important to remember those things. But for this batch of animals from which this muck samples came from, they wouldn't need a treatment for Nematodirus, despite having 200 eggs per gram in there. I suppose before we move on to the next case, it's just to consider, well, what's the problem with doing a white drench anyway? Because it's quite cheap, and I hear this quite a lot. And we need to just think that each time we worm something, every time we deliver that wormer into an animal, we risk we're exposing parasites, internal parasites, to that anthelmintic, and something will survive that. So we are increasing the risk of resistance. So this fits in with the targeted treatment. We are trying to, with our flock health plans and parasite plans, make sure that we're targeting our treatment for the right time and the right type of worm. So there's a risk of resistance. It's an extra handling event that you may not need to do. And also sometimes I think when, as practically as farmers, we're practical, we want to do something. Giving a white drench is doing something, but it could help us or create the issue where we actually miss something in terms of we may have other strong gals there that are starting to become a problem, but because we've used a drench, we think we've covered for that. However, if we've got resistance, white drench resistance to other classes of strong gals, which we know is a widespread issue, we could then end up with parasite gastroenteritis and other causing disease. So we just need to, that there are problems with just doing a white drench anyway. So what would the next steps be on that case? So always, a fecal egg count is a snapshot in time. We need to repeat that, and that needs to be form part of the monitoring that we do on growing lambs. The lambs are, when they're growing, we want them to grow, and if it means that we can monitor by taking regular fecal egg counts to help guide us, that is really helpful. So definitely we would be monitoring here. There's a strong gal count there of 425. That's likely to start rising as we're going into the growing season. So that is quite important that we monitor that. And also weigh those lambs, make sure clinically that they're doing well, and then look at whether we can change grazing or how we're going to graze. Are we moving on to cleaner pasture, different types of grazing? So there's a few things we can do based on the back of that to reduce improve the growth rates of those lambs. Just a little bit on the accuracy of a fecal egg count. I won't dwell on this because it's a big topic, but it's a reminder for those of us that are on the call. Obviously, sampling technique is crucial. There are different levels of accuracy with how we count things, but what we can do on the actual ground as farmers and vets is make sure we take good samples, that it's fresh, that we have an even-sized amount from each lamb, using a thumb size or using a little scoop. This is using the wormer, talking about the pathway here, using the wormer treatment check aspect of the pathway. Funding in England this is where really helpful. We could do a pooled sample there and start that monitoring practice. Make sure we select lambs that are representative of the group. There's a real tendency to try and pick out the ones that are scouring, and that will give us an inaccurate fecal egg count, not least because of the watery consistency of the feces can dilute that count. So it's really important that you are selecting the lambs that are representative of the group, and then follow the methodology closely, because you'll forget bits, I do, and just make sure you're closely following that and speak with the vet or the lab if you've got any queries. That will help get the best out of a fecal egg count. Right, so the second case, this farmer submitted a muck sample again, and this was in spring, this was in March. These, again, from 10 lambs were in this group. These lambs were born indoors in January, just moving into February. This was an indoor lambing flock. The actual fecal egg count here showed 90 trichostrongyl eggs, a very low level of Nematodirus 10, and no cocci. Again, do we need to treat the lambs for Nematodirus based upon that fecal egg count? And hopefully people that are listening are starting to get the message that we can't make that decision, and neither should we, for reasons that have been discussed before. So we've got to consider what else is going on. And again, this leads strongly back to the risk factors. So the age of the lambs. So these lambs were in the perfect age for grazing. We have to look at that forecast and what is happening. And the hatch was, we were in peak hatching time in March. So that has upped the risk in terms of treatment. They weren't well, these animals. They were starting to scour, open fleeced. They didn't look, they weren't doing. And again, they were grazing high-risk pasture, quite difficult for many flocks to manage not grazing high-risk pasture. So that upped the risk for Nematodirus for these lambs. We didn't have any, at this stage, any concerns for any other treatments. So these lambs, for coccidiosis. So these lambs here, a different picture to the ones I showed in the previous case, certainly looking clinically affected. And again, just looking back at the hatching forecast here, they are right in, these samples were taken mid-March, so we're right in peak hatching. And so just, you know, to highlight the fact that those samples, we didn't see any very low levels of Nematodirus in those samples, which shows that it's not a reliable way of deciding whether we need to treat for Nematodirus. All of the other things are, because it's the immature larvae that are doing the damage. So again, based on the risk factors in the table, we decided that yes, we would need to treat these. It's very likely to treat them for Nematodirus. It's helpful to consider whether we can move them to a lower risk pasture, and consider lambs that may be coming, that are younger at that stage, may be coming along behind them, and how we can manage them. And then the next question is, once we decided whether we need to treat them, what are we going to use? And Lindsay touched on this really nicely. And so really this re-emphasises what we might choose. So benzimidazole would be the class of treatment. Albendazole, ricobendazole are really what we would choose for treating Nematodirus. Again, we have to consider that this isn't a farm that hasn't got suspected resistance. That would require a different conversation. But on the whole, it's still a recommended treatment. We do have to consider whether there's other strongyles there, and the same questions apply. So from the fecal egg counts, whilst they're not useful for determining whether we need to treat for Nematodirus, they are useful to tell us what may be coming in the coming weeks, and that's where fecal egg counts and the different questions that arise are really helpful. Other anthelmintics do cover Nematodirus, but benzimidazoles have got the highest activity against them, being that they're able to kill the eggs as well. And also important, again, following Scott's principles, the drenching technique, making sure we're using the right amount, that we've weighed the animals and we've got a very good idea of how much to give them. And also whether we need to retreat, and there are occasions where we need to do that if we've got prolonged hatching, or if we've got, I think Leslie mentioned different fields on the same farm but at different altitudes can give different risks. So it's a case of considering those risks and different groups. So to summarise, each farm is different, and I know that this hasn't simplified it at all, but hopefully what it's done is made people think that we've got to ask these questions and that it's very different on each farm. So the forecast is a crucial part of that management, because it helps drive our decision, but it's not to be used in isolation. So making sure we use all the different risk questions that I've considered and that we've mentioned on here, and then look at how we can control it. We don't have to rely on a chemical, anthelmintics, to control nematodirus. We can and should also be looking at grazing management as well in combination. Right, Chris, sorry, I will finish there because I'm aware of time and we want to make sure that I'm sure people have got questions.
Yeah, we've got some questions coming in. I'll ask the other panelists to just join us on camera, including you, Neris, as an SQP and an advisor. You're on the front line as well. I'm glad you put that second case study up, Philip, because I got that one right. The first one I was a bit more confused about. So I'm glad you put up an easy one. I'm sure it wasn't just for me, but I think what you've highlighted there is it's so important to consider the farm nuances, the things that are going on in that particular farm. The tool's helpful to us, the forecasting tool, but there's so much more that the farmer and the advisor, if they're involved in one, need to bring in mind. Have we got Neris coming back on? Are you there, Neris? I can't see you on my screen. Yeah, good.
Here.
Well, we'll just take 10 or 15 minutes. There was a bit of delay getting everybody in, so we are running a little bit behind, but I'm sure, given that there's still nearly 200 people online, there's an interest here. And this, for me, is a really interesting bit. How do we take the information that Leslie and Lindsay and Philip, to a degree, have given us, and how does that change our sort of decisions at the end of the day? Because from a farmer's point of view, as you said, both Leslie and Lindsay, this is something that can just strike. And it scares the bejesus out of the farmers, I think, because they don't want to be caught, having not done something. But equally, as you said, Leslie, we've got an obligation to make sure that we're only treating when we should do, because of that environmental footprint. So we've got quite a good list of questions, and I just remind people, if you've got a question, please pose it in the chat. I'll try and come to it. I'll group some of the questions together. Let's start with a nice, easy one. Again, going back a bit to perhaps you, Lindsay, the hatching period. A couple of questions around what might affect that. Would a dry summer like 2025, for instance, would that have any impact on desiccating or killing off those dormant eggs or dormant larvae? Dormant eggs.
So I think for Nematodirus, the answer would probably be no, because the infective larvae stays within the eggshell over summer, so it's really protected in that environment from drought, from temperature fluctuations. And at that point, the eggs will be in the soil layer, so they're really quite happy sitting there, and it'll be really quite well protected. That's where Nematodirus differs quite a lot from a lot of the other gut roundworms, which we could see that desiccation and reduction. So no, I think they'd be quite happy just sitting there in their eggshells.
And staying with you, but happy for others to come in here. Thinking then about sort of, I hate to use the word climate change, but milder winters, for instance, in the southwest. If you don't get a cold spell, what constitutes a cold spell? And if you don't get a cold spell, does that presumably then delay the hatch?
So I think for the temperature, the exact temperature, I can't quite remember off the top of my head what constitutes a chill for Nematodirus, but we would generally see it over the winter. It probably wouldn't impact on the spring hatch. That would be more the kind of weather conditions in the lead up to that hatching date, so how quickly the temperature rises up then. But we are seeing some Nematodirus eggs that maybe don't require that same chill kind of stimulus that we expect, and I think that's a parasite evolution. The parasites are continually evolving and trying to improve their transmission, their chances of being transmitted. So that, be aware that not all Nematodirus require that chill stimulus. So yeah, I think it's more on the temperatures leading up to the mass hatch, and that's really what the forecast is monitoring.
Yeah, and bring others in here a bit, because there's a couple of questions about August treatment or later treatments. Anyone want to comment on those? So either later hatching or August treatments. Leslie.
Well, I can comment on a generalisation, but I think Lindsay could give some background, because obviously this question about an autumn hatch, we do see a challenge in the autumn sometimes, and I know Lindsay can explain sometimes. She's alluded to this now in the sense that some of the Nematodirus are differently adapted. I think what we've got to remember about the autumn situation is, though, just to re-emphasise the fact that if lambs have met Nematodirus, particularly on a trickle basis, as they do when we get a mild run up to it, they do develop immunity, and they develop immunity to Nematodirus sooner, at an earlier age, than they do to the other strongars, and it's pretty good. So if they've met it, even if there is a hatch in the autumn, it's not going to bother them. I've only ever seen two, and it's been where we've brought ewe lambs down from the north where they haven't met Nematodirus for whatever reason, and they've walked straight into a high challenge on a lowland farm down here. So I have seen it. But in the run up to the webinar today, I did actually contact Rebecca Mearns at APHA, and she looked at their VIDA data, and I also spoke to one or two other people. And the general, and Philip will come in here, because the general feeling is that it's actually quite rare. It's not never, but it's quite rare to find a true nematodirosis in the autumn that isn't associated with other mixed infections. So, you've got to remember, you trichostrongars and so on, there's lots of other stuff going on. You've got animals that are perhaps had a touch of pneumonia, they've had all sorts of other things by the time they get to the autumn. So we're not saying never, but it isn't something that people are seeing a lot of with straight nematodirosis in the autumn.
Do you want to comment, Philippa, or I've got a question for you otherwise?
Okay, no, I was just nodding, saying yes, that I would agree. I think we see it in conjunction with other things. I've seen it, but more in conjunction with other infections as well, usually other strongyles. And I think it's difficult to determine what's having the dominant effect on those animals. I do notice sometimes that the scour or the diarrhea can just look a little bit different, which prompts that it might be more nematodirus driven. I've never fully been convinced, but I think that's when I have, considered it.
And I think you covered it in your first case study, that kind of later hatch. In that particular case study, there were a number of other factors that led you to believe that you didn't need to treat for nematodirus. In that the peak hatch there was later in June, but you felt the animals were older and had built up a bit of immunity.
Yeah, so the sample and the animals were in June, and the samples had been taken in June, and we had nematodirus eggs in there, but the peak hatch had happened a lot earlier in the season, probably around the time that the lambs were being born, or when they were a week or two old. So they'd actually missed that peak hatch, which was helpful. And also they'd obviously had a trickle exposure. So they'd got eggs, they'd got adults, but it had not clinically caused disease in them. So that's a good outcome as far as we're concerned.
And it not necessarily relating specifically to the nematodirus, but there was a question to case study one about the 425 eggs per gram of the trichostrongars.
Yeah.
Would you consider treating for those? That's a slightly separate question, but might as well answer it while we're here.
Well, in that case, I saw the question. It's a really good question. In that case, all the other things applied in terms of how they were doing, the animals as well. And because in that case they were growing well, they weren't clinically affected. I wasn't on that level, that fecal egg count. I wouldn't consider treating on that. No, I would consider monitoring that situation to see whether they're it's likely that they're on the rise, but because the animals are clinically well, growing well, I wouldn't treat at that level for those strongyles.
And in a situation where you've treated, there's a question there about how quickly exposed are those treated lambs to being reinfected, and it's kind of linked to how long can a peak hatch period last. And I was looking at that slide you put up. Some of those peak hatches, those black bits, covered 2 weeks. I think the Aberporth one did, and then a red period. So that's quite a long period. So the question is, if you've treated, how susceptible will those lambs be to reinfection?
That is it's a really good question. I think because the treatment doesn't persist for long. It's not a long persistent effect from that drug. So, and they can definitely potentially be exposed, you know, almost immediately if in that time period. So I think I did put it on one of the slides that one of the nuances is that we've got to consider we may need to retreat in that situation where the peak hatch is going on for quite a while, and also where you might have at-risk animals, so younger animals coming along, you know, on the same farm on similar pastures. Please jump in, others, if you want to add.
I was just going to say that after the peak hatch has happened, those larvae are then on that pasture, and they'll remain on that pasture for a little while. So the Nematodirus larvae are quite susceptible to UV rays, and so that's what kind of kills them off. So it's thought that after about a month, the contamination level will have reduced quite significantly, but for a few weeks, those larvae will be kicking around on pasture, infecting lambs.
So does anyone else want to comment? And otherwise I'll go on. There's a couple of other questions to cover. There was I think that answers the retreat question because of that prolonged, somebody was asking, should you retreat if you've got a prolonged hatch? So I think we've answered that one. While we're on treatments though, there was one about if you've got a wide spread of age of lambs in your group, what would your advice be there? How would you tackle that?
I think my first comment would be try to avoid that, you know, from a point of view, well, from a point of view of all sorts of things, Chris. Mixed age groups of lambs are always going to be much more susceptible. If coccidiosis is another classic where older lambs are you know, are building up a problem for younger lambs. So, you know, as a management tool, trying to group lambs according to age is a really useful thing to do. Now, I appreciate in small flocks that can be more difficult, and that does mean that you have to look at that group slightly differently. And those are the circumstances, I think, Philippa, Lindsay, where the retreat may well be much more an issue, where you may well have to go in because younger lambs are going to still be in that frame, whereas the older ones might have moved on and be able to withstand it.
There's a brilliant question in the questions there about the developed immunity, and is there any hope for a vaccine? That's a new one on me. I've not heard that commented on. Would anyone like to pick that one up? Is there a hope for a vaccine?
So it is something that is being looked at, just because they do, like you say, they do develop that immunity quite rapidly. It's not something that we've got on the go quite yet, but has the potential for a bit of future research in there.
On terms of persistency, there's one there about how long will the larvae, the eggs, how long can they exist on the pasture? So you were saying, Lindsay, about last year's lambs, last year's fields used, potential risk, high risk pasture the following summer, spring, sorry. But how long would that last for? If you graze that field with cattle for that year and then put sheep back the following year, presumably the risk is gone or not?
So the risk would be reduced. It won't be zero because not all of our eggs will hatch. The vast majority of them would have hatched in that following spring. So if you were to graze that field at the time of the peak hatch of Nematodirus and slightly after it with cattle or older ewes that have immunity, then yeah, that would reduce down your contamination. But whilst the Nematodirus larvae are still in their eggshells, it won't make any difference because they're sitting in the soil level. It's what you're grazing at that peak hatch in the spring. So yeah, if you avoided grazing that land the following spring, then after that it should be reduced, but it still wouldn't be zero.
You sound like my insurance broker.
Putting in the little caveats.
I think we're kind of getting to the end of the questions that have been posed. Is there anything that we've not covered, do you feel, in the Q&A or in the presentations that you've thought you wanted to say before we come to an end to the technical bits on the Nematodirus? But for me, I think the headline is that the Nematodirus forecast tool is a tool, but it has to be used with other bits of information, and that's where the farmer and or with advice from the advisor, if they've got one, need to consider so many other things that could be going on within the farm. And I think that's the complicated bit, and you brought that out really well in your little sort of chart, Philippa, the kind of the highlighting the risk bit. So that's the bit which is my take home. I think go through that risk assessment, use the tool to give me an idea of when the hatch, the alert bit is going to be, but I've got to consider all the things which I'm doing in my management alongside that. So I hope that's been helpful to everyone on the call. Before we go, though, the interest that's been generated by this, I'm sure, is due to the kind of the credibility of Scops. Nerys, would you just like to spend a couple of minutes giving us a heads up as to what's coming down the track in terms of Scops activity this year?
Yes, I would. Thank you, Chris. Hopefully everyone can see my slides there. So before everyone logs off, just wanted to highlight what's coming next from Scops and where you can find further information. This webinar will appear on several platforms. So if you want to recommend it to a colleague, or you've missed an element, or you thought, I haven't quite understood that, you can go back and listen. We are also going to add to this by having a podcast which will be released on the 19th of March. So if you aren't already aware of the Scops podcast, go on, subscribe, and then you will be alerted to when it's released. Another bit of work that we're working on is we're working with Elanco to upgrade the current blowfly forecast, and we are looking for people to report incidents of fly strike this year. There'll be a link in the next slide. We're also working with Edinburgh University on the sustainable control of hemoncosis in the UK livestock grazing systems. Gosh, that's a mouthful, isn't it? But basically, the FMATCHA training card is the be all and that will be, I believe, launched at the Sheep Vet Conference on the 11th of May. So keep your eyes out for that. We are working, we've mentioned FECs today, so we are working on FEC interpretation, and there will be a new web page later this spring with a bit more information on interpreting a fecal egg count and what things we should and shouldn't be looking for. And if you are going to be at Malvern, the NSA, on the 28th of July, please do come and see us, because we will have a stand there. And finally, where can you find further information? So we have alluded to the Scops podcast website. So we've got the latest news and forecasts and technical information on there, as well as the technical guides that we've produced and updated. We do have social media presence, but you won't see it as Scops, because it is in fact goes through the National Sheep Association, which is the secretariat for Scops. And I've just put them all there because they are worded slightly different depending on what social media platform you use. So if you want to follow those, we will put all our press releases and any webinars and activity that we do on those socials. As we said, there's today's webinar. We are hoping, based on the success of today, that we will run some more throughout the year. So if there's any particular topics you are particularly interested in learning more about, please do get in touch with us. We do also have a YouTube channel, which we haven't put much on recently, but this webinar and further Nematodirus information will be appearing on there in the next few days. So do give that channel a look if you are on YouTube. I've already mentioned the podcasts. We've got 14 episodes there that don't date. So that's the beauty of those, is that they will still be appropriate whether they were released last year or last month. And then finally, door open, there is the link there for any blowfly tracker report. So we would like a postcode, ideally 4 or 5 digits of a postcode, because we're looking at the forecast and we'd like to look at strike information alongside that this year. So without further ado, thank you everybody for watching. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. And I have seen, I don't know if you're going to cover this, Chris, but if you are an SQP with AMTRA, then you can get 4 CPD points for today by self-reflection and listening to the webinar. But if you want to double your points and get 8 of them, there will be 20 multiple choice questions up on the website at the end of this webinar. So you can double your points by answering some questions. So yeah. I did see a few had put their SQP number in the chat. So it's probably just worth clarifying that you don't automatically get points for joining. You'd have to do self-reflection or answer the MCQ.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thanks, Neris, for that. So that's in the AMTRA CPD Academy for those. I love that. Double your money. Go to the AMTRA site to double your money for the points. So I think we've covered the points issue. It's my job to thank all of you as speakers. It's one of the pleasures of being able to chair this, and throughout my career I've listened to most of you speak, and I always find you fascinating. Your depth of knowledge and experience on these things helps me understand the subject, so I hope we've helped our audience this afternoon. Thank you all for the time and thought you put into it. I'd just like to thank again SCOPS as an organisation and all a group of organisations within SCOPS who've helped promote this event, to the Sheep Vet Society in particular, BVA, Moredun, Lindsay, thanks for your support. Pleasure to be involved in that as RUMA. The recording of this, if you've missed it, and for those who weren't online, who won't be listening to me speak now, the recording will be on the SCOPS site as soon as I can get it off the server and share it with Neris and Leslie, and it'll also be on the RUMA website, and it will be within the AMTRA website as well. So it will be in various websites. And Neris has mentioned that we hope this is the beginning of a series of webinars. RUMA will certainly do one with cows later in the spring, but I'd like to come back with SCOPS and do something later. So watch this space. We'll be in touch through whichever channel you heard from us. So thanks very much, everyone. I'm going to let us all go and enjoy the start of our evening, and look forward to seeing you the next time. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
everybody.
Thanks, Chris. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.